Indeed, it's time to deliver. So a very, very warm welcome from Berlin-Kreuzberg to all over the world. So we're here with some of the W7 advisors in the room, and they are going to make some noise so they can hear them. Thank you so much, because it's good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you're joining in from. We are very proud that you're taking your time to be with us today. My name is Juliane Rosin. I'm the head of international affairs at Deutscher Frauenrat, which translates into the National Council of German Women's Organization. And they are very, very proudly hosting the W7 this year. And we are really excited because today the Chancellor and the G7 President, Olaf Scholz, will join us and we'll hand over our recommendations to him, the outcome of a very intense process for several months. And I assume you're also very keen on reading what we came up with, so no worries. Just join us on our website, w7.org. There you find everything you need, our communique, the implementation plan, but also information on our speakers and the schedule for today. But this is not the only place you shall visit. Just engage with us on social media. You can find us on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and obviously Twitter, just at W7Official. And please use the hashtags W7 Summit 2022, but you also can use the hashtag Time to Deliver. And last but never least, you're joining us through our website, and there you can see there's a chance to chat with us and engage with us. And we have a very first question we want your answer to. What do you think is the most important thing right now to achieve gender justice? So what's the most important thing to achieve gender justice? Please give us your quick and short answer, just 1 to 3 words, and we'll take a look at it later during the day and show you the results. So just some final remarks. The most part of the program will be in English today, but the Chancellor himself will speak and answer our questions in German and give his speech in German. But no worries, there's a chance to click somewhere behind around the screen, and there you can change the languages from English to German and the other way around. And as I said, you are very welcome to engage with us and post your questions and comments, especially during the panel. You have a chance to also vote on questions someone else put there. And we take all the questions very seriously. Just might be possible because we're very tight on time that we don't manage to answer all of those. But so please vote on the questions so we know what's the most important thing for you to know. And well, the good audience already realized that someone's sitting just behind me, so I will join her. Let me introduce Diana Sarosi. She is working at Oxfam as a director of policy and campaigns. And you're sitting here because you're based in Canada. And Canada was hosting the very first ever W7 Summit back in 2018. Yes, and we met there. So I assume we learned a lot during this very special time for you. So is there anything you want to exchange with us about your experience?
Yeah, thank you. It was indeed a very exciting time. I think the Canadian presidency really set a new precedent in terms of addressing gender equality within the G7. They created the Gender Advisory Council. They mainstreamed gender throughout. And yeah, lessons that we learned from that is it is important to engage with the GIAC. And, you know, it's sad to hear that it's been kind of late on the German front with the GIAC being established. And that's one of the things I'm looking forward to hearing from the Chancellor later about. But also it's important to go with priorities that the government has set, right? Like you get the most momentum on the issues that the government wants to move forward to. So in this context this year, we know that care is really important for the German presidency, and they have prioritized it. They're very active in the Global Alliance on Care, right? So use that as an opportunity to really push forward really great progress on that. Feminist Foreign Policy is another one, for example. And then also the ministerials are very important avenues for influencing. We're sort of focused on the leaders track, right? But there are all these ministerials where I think it's much easier to get voices into those spaces from civil society and really push for civil society to be part of the agenda, right? And then, yeah, advocacy really needs to happen at all G7 country levels, right? They all need to agree for something to move forward. So it's really important that, you know, the activists really focus on their own countries during that time.
Yeah, I think the video in the beginning just pointed out this as well, because most people believe it's just a 2 days event, right? And all the decisions are just being made there. And yeah, it's a bunch of negotiations, and we as civil society need to organize ourselves. And then we need to be ready to present our recommendations in all those tracks, but we need to organize ourselves. And this is what I think W7 does quite well at the moment.
Exactly.
So, but your impression from yesterday, what do you take with you?
I think one highlight for me was the speech by Lisa Paus, and especially when she mentioned that feminism is the antidote to authoritarianism, right? And that's really great to hear. But it's not really clear to me yet whether governments understand that it's women's rights organizations that are making that change, that are organizing, that are, you know, really sustaining these gains. And I think often that's not quite clear to governments. And, you know, this has been studied. There's evidence behind it. And because it's not quite clear to them, there's just not enough support for women's rights organizations. The resources have been very tight, and especially throughout the pandemic, a lot of resources have gone to multilateral bodies like the UN, COVAX, and so on, right? And with ODA not increasing, that means, once again, women's rights organizations are the last ones to receive resources. So, yeah, I think it's really important that we bring that message very clearly to them. And then the other thing that always strikes me is the governments say the right thing, right? They're saying the same things as us in many cases, right? But when it really comes to putting that into action, that's where sort of the gap is. So really focusing on implementation of what they're promising. We have the laws, we have the policies, you know, but also really thinking through what's a feminist approach to policy making, you know, and that really means working again with women's rights organizations. Often it's consultation, but I would say, no, let's make it collaboration, right? And and work together in getting these things implemented because it takes that, you know, engagement on all levels. And then what's also struck me is sort of, you know, we're at a very interesting time in history where we're experiencing one crisis after another, and that's not going to go away. It's probably going to get worse. And so with governments sort of constantly wrapped up in the urgent things, the important things don't happen. And so a lot of the things that we're sort of working on are the important things, right? Like it was really great to hear yesterday that the German government wants to have a feminist development assistance policy, right? But again, development assistance is seen as important, not urgent. And so really making sure there are resources, capacity to keep those important things moving forward, I think is going to be a real challenge for all of us. You know, we've heard this G7 is very much preoccupied with the war in the Ukraine. Obviously, it needs to be. It's a terrible situation. But again, there are important things that also need to move forward. So keeping an eye on that.
Yes, not just to add the cherry on top, but keeping the system alive.
Exactly.
I mean, using the term feminist development policy, feminist foreign policy, it's about transforming something to really change something, just starting with the roots. And, well, at least it's promising they're changing the words, and we're keep on watching them, right?
Yes.
So what are you looking forward today?
Well, I'm obviously really looking forward to the speech by the Chancellor. It's exciting that he's here today and wants to listen to us. As I mentioned, I'm very keen to hear more about what he envisions for the GIAC. But then also, I'm always interested to hear, what are some of the challenges they're facing in moving forward progressive feminist policy. So hopefully in the questions we get some of that as well.
We will definitely listen very carefully. And we start listening to the recommendations of the W7 once again, because we have our next panel, the third panel of the summit, just coming up. And it's about ending gender violence as a prerequisite for feminist foreign policy. It will be moderated by my dear colleague, Madita Stanke-Erdmann. But prior to that, here you have the voices of the W7. Thank you so much.
Hi G7.
Violence against women and girls and gender-based violence are human rights violations.
They are both cause and consequence of gender inequality, and they undermine all other efforts aimed at women's participation and empowerment.
We, W7 advisors, thus call on the G7 to commit sufficient financing and funding for GBV prevention, response, and protection,
and enable quality prevention that is accessible to women and girls in all their diversity in conflict and crisis-affected regions.
To ensure solid commitment and investment in promoting sexual and reproductive rights, and increased access to contraception and safe abortion services, both in their countries and overseas.
To commit to eradicating female genital mutilation, forced and child marriage.
Dedicate 25% of GBV funding to women's rights organizations and feminist movements.
Gender inequality and unequal power relations are central obstacles to sustainable peace.
We call for a foreign policy that dismantles patriarchal, colonial, and racist power structures.
We call for a radical shift in foreign policy towards a feminist foreign policy, where decisions are based on participation, inclusion, and a human rights-based approach.
We, the W7 advisors, call on the G7 to implement a feminist foreign and development policy in all G7 states.
Promote and improve the rights of women, LGBTQIA+ people, indigenous communities, BIPOC people, people with disabilities, the youth and elders at all levels.
Decrease the military funding and increase the funding of feminist women's NGOs.
And to put gender equality in the center of programs funded by the official development assistance.
And also, we request you eliminate all norms and activities that persecute and criminalize women's rights defenders worldwide.
So, G7 leaders, are you ready? It is time to deliver.
Are you ready?
It's time to deliver.
It is time to deliver.
Thank you very much, Juliana, for handing over to us. I think these incredibly powerful messages from W7 activists present a fantastic start to the discussion today on the future of ending gender-based violence and putting a feminist foreign policy on the table. Before I introduce you, the distinguished panel, to our audience, just a quick reminder for our audience online that I have this lovely iPad here where you can send questions to if you have them, and we'll feed them into our discussion later on. And since we're running on a tight schedule, I hope that we will have the chance to talk as much and discuss as much as we can today about this really pressing issue. But before I introduce everyone, let's take a moment to think about why it is so crucial to have this debate today, here, and now. First of all, last week, the Netherlands announced plans to adopt a feminist foreign policy, joining a group of states that have already announced to adopt one. And without a doubt, this is a really exciting moment for the transnational feminist movement. And it gives hope to a more holistic practice of foreign and security policy that is human rights-based, that is inclusive and participatory. However, this news comes at a time of multiple and persisting crises, but also emerging global and intersecting crises. And we spoke about the gendered effects of the pandemic and the climate crisis yesterday already. And these link undoubtedly to the war in and against Ukraine, the global food and nutrition crisis, and the sovereign debt crisis in the so-called global south. And looking at some examples, almost a year ago, we witnessed how the so-called Western allied forces withdrew from Afghanistan with no strategy or lack of support for staff who worked for international and national organizations, resulting in life-threatening consequences, particularly for women and girls and marginalized groups in the country. At the same time, what we're also witnessing is the strengthening of anti-rights and anti-gender and gender backlash movement with violent consequences for women, girls, and LGBTIQ all over the world, and this includes G7 states. So these crises really make visible that the ancient feminist concept of the continuum of violence remains painfully valid. Gender-based violence is not only an issue in militarized conflict, where, for instance, rape is used systematically as a weapon of war. Violence permeates societies. It is inherent to and reinforces structural, that is, racialized, gendered, and class global inequalities. And as current crises show, these inequalities condense in unequal access to political and economic participation, education, or land. We've known for a long time that how foreign policy is practiced actually shapes and affects the everyday lives of people, and it disproportionately does so to historically marginalized groups such as women, girls, LGBTIQ, and BIPOC. And it's becoming increasingly frustrating that these members of society are largely excluded from decision-making processes and inner circles of foreign policy, even though inclusive instruments for more peaceful and gender-just societies exist. So this calls for many things. It calls for a change in foreign policy and in security policy. It calls on leaders to listen to civil society, activists, and women-led NGOs who have the knowledge and experience. And this is one of the reasons why the W7 network has gathered to formulate concrete demands to implement a feminist foreign policy and to push for measures that end gender-based violence. And this is why we're here today. So before we engage in the discussion, I'd like to introduce our panelists to the audience in the room and online. So first of all, a warm welcome to who's joining us today, Sanam Naragi Andalini, MBE, the founder and CEO of the International Civil Society Action Network, ICANN, and director of the Center for Women, Peace and Security at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Thank you so much for being here, Sanam. You co-authored the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 in 2000, so it's been a while, and have been acting as a hinge between civil society, academia, and policy, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's indeed a privilege to be with you.
Thank you. Next, Nahisha Halimi, you're a founder of We the Women and editor of a collection of essays portraying Afghan women, experts in their stories of struggle and hope in Afghanistan, but you're also an artist, a filmmaker, a producer, and have been active in making Afghan women's voices heard and visible in the world for so many years. And we're so happy that you're here today with us. Next to my left is Spogme Ahmed. You're a senior global policy advocate for the International Center on Research on Women. And Spogme, you're an expert in multilateral bodies, such as the G7, and also one of our W7 advisors, on feminist foreign policy. And we're really grateful to have you here today in Berlin. And last but not least, we also have Minister of State for Europe and Climate, Dr. Anna Lührmann, who is not here yet. She's at the Federal Foreign Office and should be joining us in a minute, actually, as the representative of the German government and the German G7 presidency. And we hope that she'll be here any minute. Right. And last but not least, Fumi Saito, who will wrap up the panel later on. We'll get you on stage in a minute. Great. Now, the title of today's panel has kind of twofold feminist vision, right? First, it reminds us that ending GBV calls for nothing but to structurally change our societies and to overcome their patriarchal and often neo-colonial underbelly. And second, it puts forward that a true feminist foreign policy can only be implemented if we achieve such groundbreaking societal change on a global and local level. And this is why I'd like to start a first round of discussion about where we stand globally in our endeavors to reach this utopia. So Spogme, the W7 call for an implementation of a feminist foreign policy in all G7 states. And could you just give us a brief overview of what core principles a feminist foreign policy entail and how the W7 actually suggests that these can help address the multiple crises that we're facing?
Sure. Thank you so much, Medita, for the question and the opportunity to be here with you all today. It's been such a rewarding process being part of the W7, and I'm so excited to get to join you all in Berlin. And to speak about one of my favorite topics, of feminist foreign policy. So I think you've laid it out really well in your opening as well. Feminist foreign policy is a comprehensive approach to foreign policy that prioritizes peace, gender equality, and environmental integrity. And it seeks to redress the wrongs of the past by charting forward a pathway that is more productive, iterative, and inclusive. It aims to disrupt oppressive systems and structures that are holding back progress by centering the human rights of women and girls. So on the core principles of feminist foreign policy, I'll name about 7 or so, but it's a non-exhaustive list, as I'm sure that many more will emerge throughout the course of this conversation and the rest of the agenda today. So first and foremost, feminist foreign policy should centralize a focus on rights, recognizing that women's rights are human rights and the need to be unapologetic in that stance. It should also be representative, inclusive, and responsible to stakeholders, meaning as states are developing a feminist foreign policy, they should prioritize consultation with feminist movements and civil society, including and particularly with indigenous and marginalized communities, which are often left out of traditional policy making. Thirdly, embracing intersectionality, which I'm glad has been a theme throughout the W7 Summit, as foundational to analysis and implementation, recognizing the differential power structures that exist and the effects that they have on women of various and overlapping identities. Another major theme is resources, of course. So feminist foreign policy is not just words on paper. We want to see a % increase in domestic and foreign budgets to gender equality. So as the W7, we've been calling for 100% of official development assistance to address gender equality and for at least 20% of those funds to specifically target gender equality as a main objective. And we want to ensure that funds are flowing to the right places. So not towards increased militarization and war, but towards social services and positive reforms that are protecting and advancing human rights. I'll make also a point about accountability. So in feminist foreign policy, we want to see time-bound and measurable commitments, making sure that it's possible to monitor and evaluate what states are committing to, and making sure that we have a means of understanding progress, making sure that it's being successful, finding ways to fill gaps in progress and continue to chart our way forward. I'll also point out what ICRW and our partners call reach, or comprehensiveness, which means that any principles that are taken up in foreign policy should also be taken up in domestic policy, and that feminist foreign policy is not just about one facet of foreign policy, but it should be mainstreamed and included throughout several thematic priorities. So that means aid, development assistance, trade, security, climate change, disaster response, health, finance, pursuing an all-inclusive rights-based approach to policymaking. And the last point I'll make is that feminist foreign policy should really be evolutionary and transformative, recognizing that process is really one of the most important parts. Feminist foreign policy is a strategy to ensure that we're always improving and correcting our wrongs and allowing ourselves the flexibility to remain productive and nimble. So all of these things should really help in addressing the multiple crises that the world is facing today, as feminist foreign policy urges countries, particularly those in the global north, to understand their positionality in the world and to recompense for past faults so that we don't make the same mistakes in the future.
Great. Thank you so much, Bagme, for setting the stage once again. And we now have Minister of State Anna Luhrmann here with us. Thank you so much for coming. Hi.
Oh, sorry for the delay. We had
No
a
worries.
cabinet meeting, so yeah.
All good, all good. Thank you so much for coming. We're really delighted to have you. So we kind of started the first round of discussion. So if you don't mind, we'll just continue. Great. Sanam, the next question I would like to direct to you. You have gained a tremendous amount of experience in policy and research on the Women, Peace and Security agenda, to which ending GBV is in militarized conflict and wars as a core issue. So with the WPS agenda turning 22 years this year, actually, where do you see the main challenges in implementing a feminist foreign policy?
Thank you. I'm sorry not to be with you in person, but thank you for having me online. I wanted to add to the comments of my colleague who was just talking about the concept of feminist foreign policy. And if we situate it in the work that we've done so far, so 22 years ago, it was a global campaign that came from women in war zones saying we need the Security Council to acknowledge women's experiences in war, not only in terms of what happens to them as victims and survivors of conflict, but also in terms of their agency and how they're engaged in peacemaking and in conflict prevention, and also in terms of the needs of, say, women who were in fighting forces and so forth. So there is an element going back 22 years that we were saying it's really important to think about the people on the ground. And it's really important to consider gender responsiveness. So when we say, how do our policies have take into consideration the needs of women and girls? It's really simple in many ways. It's saying you're providing humanitarian aid. What does that look like? If you have to provide health and shelter to refugees and displaced persons, have you understood or have you taken into consideration the different needs of women and girls versus men and boys? It's been 22 years that we've been saying simple things, sanitary products, healthcare. It's not rocket science, but we have institutional blocks that are happening. Our humanitarian agencies, which governments have brought all of the humanitarian agencies that receive government funding to provide humanitarian aid, whether it's the UN system or international organizations, and said to them, you do strategies and practice of hunger prevention, you provide shelter, well, why not sexual violence prevention in humanitarian settings? It's up to them. That responsibility to think about it is there. We have practices, but it's not being done. So 22 years since the adoption of the WPS agenda, which is in a way the precursor to this idea of feminist foreign policy, we are really at a point where we have to say, what's it going to take? We asked for reduction in military expenditure. We now have over $2 trillion this year being spent on weaponry, right? We've just seen another shooting in the United States of kids, with an AR-15. The idea that violence is acceptable and peace or dialogue and negotiations is seen as weak needs to shift as well. So it's the whole. It is a transformative agenda. It is very much what I call transformative equality, because it's not that our agenda is not simply that we want we want peace for women and we don't care about the men. It's really saying we don't want our boys or our men to be going off to fight and be traumatized and maim and kill and so forth. It's really about putting violence as the very last option of everything, and hopefully not an option. Every act of violence is a choice that somebody is making. It's not inevitable. It is not necessarily, the essence of human nature, actually, because if you look at the world, even in war zones, underneath that layer of violence that the media reports on, people are trying to live their lives. And we're in a state right now where we have to ask ourselves, why is it that world war has not only been possible, but we're also thinking about it as being probable again. But the idea of world peace, which is what 99.99% of the world's population actually want and thrive in, and our businesses and our lives and so forth need, why is that perceived to be a naive in some sort of way? Why is that such, as you said, utopian? It shouldn't be utopian. That should be the norm. And it really comes down to this question of where are we spending our money? Why were we asleep at the wheel on what was going on between Russia and Ukraine from 2008 to 2014, so that now we have a war and now we're throwing so much money and weaponry and so forth at it? Where was the really intense diplomacy around that? And what's the next conflict that we should be preventing now? Because in the last 20 years that I've been in this work, over 25 years, our governments and our international system has been extraordinarily good at starting wars and being trigger happy. We have been extraordinarily bad at ending wars and fostering peace and preventing wars. And it's now gotten to the point where the public understands this. And so this idea of a feminist perspective and what the women say and what the women are doing and how we perceive these things and how inclusive our practices are, it's tested, it's researched, we know it works. It's just a question of getting it done right now. And as you said, it's about putting resources into the work of women's movements, but it's also about bringing women peace builders to the spaces and tables where these decisions are being made and heeding their voice, not just saying, oh, we had somebody and they came to the Security Council and spoke and how wonderful they were, but genuinely heeding their voices. And I'll end with this, and I'm very glad we have an Afghan colleague. If Afghan women peace builders had been in Doha throughout the negotiations, Afghanistan would not be in the state that it's in right now. And the challenges that Afghanistan and Afghan women are facing is not only in Afghanistan, because it's given resurgence to radicalization and extremism across the world. And every extremist movement we see, whether it's the ones who claim Islam or white supremacy or Hindu extremism, all of them have misogyny and the coercion of women at the heart of them. So we're in a very, very difficult stage right now. And we have a lot of answers. And as you said, it's a question of whether our governments are willing to deliver now under the auspices of feminist foreign policy. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So given our tight schedule that we're running on, I'm going to just pass over to you, Nahid. With all of your experience, all the conversations that you have had, all the women that you've talked to in Afghanistan, what do you consider missing from global foreign policy, and how do you see this happening or playing out in Afghanistan?
Thank you so much, Medita, and thank you so much for all of this, because it is extremely important, and it's lovely to be sharing the panel with everybody. Sonam, I'm a huge fan. Thank you so much, and I will chime into what Sonam and you just mentioned. Staying with Afghanistan, and I don't want to repeat everything that everybody else has said, so hoping that we can get something more. Just a couple of weeks ago, and in the last couple of weeks, actually, many European countries have diverted the budget from the WPS and UN Women projects completely and fully from many projects that exist around the world, diverting it to the Ukrainian crisis, which is extremely important. And believe me, as an Afghan, we empathize every single day. We bleed still every single day. When it comes to Afghanistan, I can tell you this much, that we have made many wrong strategic tours, or rather, there was no strategy, as you mentioned. Nevertheless, we're still making those mistakes. So the fact that we are normalizing the Taliban by engaging with them, within all delegations, all male delegations, that has nothing to do with the extremism that is going on there. Yes, they're doing horrible things. Over 24 decrees. Horrible abuses against human rights, women's rights have been happening since 15th of August till now. But women's movement and the Afghan women's movement have been, as Sonam just mentioned, they have been extremely active and have been the strongest force against the Taliban since the beginning. In 2017 and 18, when we sat in all of the conventions and Geneva and UN and everywhere, we literally painted out this blueprint of what we're living today. We warned the whole world. But again, nobody listened. Although the expertise comes from that. The top peace builder, peace practitioner comes from Afghanistan. She is there. And I spoke to her last night. And one of the countries which was really a blow to my heart is Sweden. Sweden and Norway have cut a lot of their WPS funding. And that is something that I never understand as an Afghan, as well as a Canadian, and as somebody that lives in both worlds and works in both worlds. Why do we have to? The first thing that we cut on the table is at the cost of women. We signed a peace deal, or a so-called framework of a peace deal, at the cost of women and girls. And today, that Afghanistan is the only country that does not allow its women to study secondary school, but the world is watching. Although we don't have to watch, we can do a lot of things. I'll leave it at that because I know I can speak a lot more. I'll come back to the next round.
All right. Thank you so much, Nahid, for sharing these insights with us. It's invaluable, actually, to have you all here with us today. I'm going to turn to my right side now, State Minister Anna Lyoman. In the face of all the conflicts, all the crises that we're looking at right now, and all of these insights that have been shared with you now, could you tell us what concrete steps the Foreign Office under the G7 presidency has tabled in order to implement a feminist foreign policy, and maybe also how gender-based violence plays a role in that? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for having me. And indeed, with the new government now, we're implementing a feminist foreign policy. And it's very clear that this really means a very, very broad strategy of changing a method for everyone who works in foreign policy. Not something on the side, not something that's nice to have, but really going to the center of foreign policy. To you all know the aim of 3R plus D, so representation, rights, and resources. You were talking about the importance of resources as well as diversity. So this is really, so we are basically, when we came to office half a year ago, we're caught in the middle of a lot of ongoing crisis and a big new one accelerating, but we're still keeping track, and particularly now when we're talking about Ukraine, and it becomes clear once more that crises are not gender blind, right? When we look to Ukraine, we can clearly see that women and girls are impacted differently, are impacted oftentimes worse than others. So it's very clear. I mean. Sanan talked a little bit about this. Of course, sort of at the very heart of it, we need to ask the question about prevention, right? We need to ask the question about, okay, how can we create a system actually that doesn't create those imbalances and those incentives to forge these kind of wars of aggression? That is true, and conflict prevention is also there very high on the agenda. On the other hand, I would also, maybe to spice up the discussion a little bit, also like to challenge you here a little bit, because I think we make a mistake if we sort of suggests that a feminist foreign policy is sort of creates this ideal type of world, and is sort of blind to the fact that sometimes in war, also women need to defend themselves with arms. Yeah, and we have a lot of Ukrainian women now coming to us asking for arms, asking for us to support them in their right to defend themselves, and many very brave women also fighting in Ukraine. So I think it's sort of we shouldn't be blind to that part of foreign policy as well, and that can also be actually part of a feminist foreign policy. Also, not to turn a blind eye here. You asked for concrete steps. Here, of course, in the view of these really horrific reports about gender-based violence in Ukraine, we are, of course, stepping up the support to both documenting cases and working with survivors. We've increased our yearly support on the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. In 2022, we will overall provide 1.5 million euro. We've, of course, stepped up humanitarian aid to Ukraine, which is now at over 400 million euro, and make sure in all the implementation that the feminist perspective is also there, and the gender-sensitive aid approach is used in the distribution. And we will also support a network of survivors already actually since 2014, because war has been going on in Ukraine since 2014 for the survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. So I think that's important. And finally, of course, we support the International Criminal Court by bringing those to justice, holding those to account that are the perpetuators of this violence.
Okay. Thank you very much for sharing these first points with us. I would like to initiate the second round of discussion now with all of you, kind of painting a vision or kind of the future of what a feminist foreign policy could look like, since we now took a look at where we're standing. And I think, Sanam, I would like to turn to you again, and if you would like to, chime in on what the State Minister just said. You said before that we have the instruments, we have the WPS agenda, also as part of a feminist foreign policy, as a meaningful peace-building instrument, but it's kind of absent from the discussions on Ukraine and other ongoing conflicts right now. So could you paint us a future, maybe a realistic, maybe also a little optimistic future of what this could look like? Thank you.
I just want to echo what the State Minister said. I'm not naive about the question of whether women want to fight when their lives and their nation and so forth is at stake. My point is that we should be striving not to get there, number one. And then once we're there, we should be striving to do whatever it takes to stop the violence and move the discussions back into, or move the conflict back into a dialogue space wherever possible. And within that, also taking into consideration that women who have been part of the fighting forces have their needs as we emerge from conflict. So one of the things that, for example, we saw with South Africa was that women were part of the fight against apartheid. And while many of the men ended up going into the politics, the women, actually, many of them ended up having to go into sex work because there was no program for them. So there was that level of injustice also that happens even for women who are fighting for literally also involved in the war. Two things I would say. One is Afghanistan. We have to be focused on Afghanistan and get it right, given all the wrongs that we've done. There has to be a genuine focus on how do we heed what people are saying, create spaces for the dialogue. For example, Hannah Neumann, a German MEP, went to Kabul recently, and based on conversations and discussions, the idea was, if you want to talk to the Taliban, because at some point we have to be realistic about it, make sure Afghan women are in the room. It's not rocket science. She was able to do it. Why isn't the UN or why aren't other delegations doing it systematically, right? So we have to create the spaces for direct engagement and involvement. Similarly, with the case of Ukraine, there are dialogues or there are some negotiations going on, whether it's behind the scenes or back channel or track two or whatever you want to call it. We must make sure that if we're not bringing women to the table, if we're not engaging out Ukrainian women who are peace builders at present, which we should do, right? Bring them along. They were the ones who were trying to address the issues from 2008 to 2014. Anyway, they're the ones that are still trying to do humanitarian work. Are we supporting their organizations? Are we convening them and listening and asking them for the solutions that they may have? That's one side. The other side of it is making sure that any discussions on ceasefires, truces, etc., also fold into them the question of sexual violence and safe passage for women and girls and children going through. And if the Russians tell us that it's not their soldiers perpetrating these kinds of crimes, why not have a joint investigation team to be there and challenge the, if you want, challenge the lies, challenge everybody's statements, but that are not true on the ground. We have to be moving towards some way of trying to end the violence there, but also making the process inclusive. And you know, again, for example, if we had from 2014 onwards, the business community, the religious community, the militaries from different sides, the women from different sides, young people, the media, in different spaces for dialogue between Russia, Ukraine, the OSCE, and others, would we be where we are now? And is there any way of creating that kind of a space for dialogue from now moving forward, even as the war is going on? We have to do things differently. You know, Einstein said it. You keep doing the same thing, expecting different results. It's madness. We have to change the way we think about war and that we think about peace. And at the end of the day, you know, there is the very macho element to all this, that it's all about sort of domination and coercion. I think a feminist approach to this is more around cooperation, collaboration, coexistence, and care. We have to care about the people that are paying the price for the war, for the mistakes, and for the lack of care to prevent this war and the next war and the next war.
Thank you, Sanam, so much. I would like to actually pick up on what you just said, you know, kind of creating this vision, this future, what we need. Nahid, could you... So given all of these dramatic developments in Afghanistan right now and the sheer complexities of it, could you give us maybe 3 to 4 things that, if you had the chance, which you do, to speak to G7 leader today, what do you need? What does Afghanistan need? What do Afghan women need right now?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sonam, for pointing that out. That I will chime into what Sonam just said. We need the spaces. There are too many people speaking about us, and we have the expertise. We have highly qualified Afghan female experts that go to the UNs and go to the G7 advisory boards and advise them. They advise NATO, they advise everybody, EU. I just came from Brussels for 2 days of sitting down with Thomas Nicholson and Stella, and we were doing work. We were working. We were not just talking somewhere. We were working and analyzing. And that is what we need. There was, and I, with all due respect, I say this, on 9th of March in Germany, in Berlin, there was a humanitarian session about Afghanistan. Not one single Afghan was present. That is shameless. That's shameful. We have, that is saying that we absolutely have no respect for the qualifications of these women. We have hundreds of them. I wrote about 13 of them that just came out. These 13 plus me, we have over 15 languages altogether. With the amount of years of experience, if you put them all together, it is over 150 years of experience on the field. We speak languages. We have master's degrees, doctorate degrees, but it's never enough. And that is what is so frustrating, to say that that table, fine, they didn't give it to us during the peace process, fine. But why aren't you, when you talk about solidarity with Afghan women, then what is your solidarity? Walk the talk, please. And that is not happening. That's not happening enough. In Germany, it's really horrible. In the States, it's a little bit better, but it is getting there. But we are sick and tired of lobbying 9 months, and 2 years of education is gone. So imagine, within the next year and a half, If we do not have, and we won't have, a 12-year girls that are going to be graduating from the 12th grade in the state universities, we will not have one single university student, female student, in Afghanistan. That we are not allowed to walk on the streets without a reason, or mahram and all of that stuff. That's a completely different panel, let's say. But that is the first and foremost, really a must, that the G7 leaders have to stay committed to what they have said. And I go back to what you said, accountability. We have to hold these leaders also accountable. You know, it's great to say that, so many millions and trillions of dollars went to Afghanistan. With all due respect, most of it came back through your own contractors. So there are details that we forget. And I go back to what you said before about Ukraine. Yes, Germany is doing an incredible amount of work for Ukraine, and it should. The world is doing as well. But with all due respect, there are Afghans, Syrians, Iraqis, sub-Saharan countries that have been waiting here, not allowed to go to work, not allowed to go to school, not allowed. This is selective humanitarianism, with all due respect. And there's no two way about it. We have to stop and say and basically put a scale and make these checkpoints, and to say that if I'm not blue-eyed, and we have had those words from the media, shame on all of us if we sit here in 2022 and select who gets to do what, and who gets to get food, and who gets to get humanitarian aid. We have plenty of Afghans within Germany, within all of these platforms, but nobody gives them the space. Give them the space. This process belongs to them. If you want to help Afghanistan, work with them. They can do their own work. Just give them the spaces. And that would be, I think, I won't even go to the 3-4. That is the first one that I would ask for.
Right, yeah. State Minister Luhrmann, would you mind reacting to this? Maybe how the Foreign Office thinks about creating space, I think this would be very much valued in this talk today.
No, indeed, that is a key issue. As I said, the representation part of feminist foreign policy, and representatives should, of course, always be the ones that are concerned. I took note of what you said about this meeting on 9 March. I wasn't personally involved, so I can't really comment on it, but I'll follow up and check what happened. I also I think that's sort of this working with those that are capable to actually lead the way out of their own problems. That should be the key guideline. I was myself in Afghanistan back in 2000. What was it, 5, 6, working with Sabrina Saqib, who you might know. I was at that time the youngest member of parliament here in Germany with 19 years. And she was the youngest female member of the Afghan parliament. So I went actually there for 2 weeks, and we worked a lot together there. And I did another workshop with all these wonderful women in the Afghan parliament. And then she came to Germany to, first of all, address also a lot of politicians in Germany about the situation, about what is needed. So giving space, represent their own representation, instead of me telling everyone what I saw with my eyes in Afghanistan. She came here and went also to my party colleagues and all that. And yeah, but so I totally hear what you're saying, and also with the perception of double standards, I can assure you that we've really done a lot at the EU level to make sure, for example, that in the current regulations for migrants coming from Ukraine, that they're not only those included with a Ukrainian passport, but also others and all that. But you know how difficult the discussions about migration policies at EU level are. So this is really a tricky issue. And also, if I may add here, what else we're doing now in this G7 context, we've really also made sure that now in the G7 agenda and discussions and resolutions, really also the issues of gender-based violence, of inclusiveness, are really framed also at a very high priority level.
Right. Thank you for jumping in here and for going into conversation with each other. I think this is much appreciated, and I hope this can foster more meaningful dialogue, actually. I think this would be much appreciated. So given our time frame, I would actually like to zoom in on a different topic now, a little bit with you, Spagme. I think what we learned so far on this panel is that we don't need policy that merely cushions the effects of violence in society, but that we need systemic change, right? And one thing that really affects women, BIPOC, and LGBTIQ disproportionately is that of gender backlash and anti-rights, anti-democratic movements right now. It's, given the global effects of all of these crises, I think they very much link to what we've debated before here as well. So, Spagme, given the fantastic implementation plan of the Women7 and also the communique, how do the Women7 envision to counteract these really, really dramatic and violent developments, actually?
Sure, thank you. And this is such an important question, and I think it's one that's becoming even more prevalent by the day. So in our W7 communique, we're asking G7 leaders to counteract anti-gender, anti-rights, and anti-democratic movements, as you've laid out, and to offer protection for those who are facing multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. We're also asking these governments to really follow through on their political and financial commitments and to see through their words with action and accountability. So I'll name just some of the recommendations that my fellow W7 advisors have laid out. So as related to gender-based violence, the W7 is really asking for long-term, flexible and sustainable funding for the prevention, mitigation, and redress of gender-based violence. We're also asking for the repeal of discriminatory laws, including those that criminalize sexual and reproductive health and rights, and for increased investment into SRHR as essential services. So legal protections and sustainable funding are just two mechanisms that could be used to really counteract against the growing and consistent threat of anti-gender movements. I think it's also important to recognize, particularly in this COVID-19 era, that these threats also exist online, and we should advocate for protection of human rights defenders in online spaces as well. So I think relevant to this question, we should also realize that the opposition is well funded and the opposition is well organized. I'm coming from the United States, and I know that news out of the US has been making global headlines as news around the Roe versus Wade and abortion rights decisions have been disappointing and infuriating, but it's also a case study of the effectiveness of anti-gender movements. So for years, the opposition movement was consistently organizing, building their own alliances, spreading disinformation, and seating anti-choice candidates at local, state, and national levels, including judges whose decision-making can be long-lasting and often permanent. Anti-gender groups are also organizing at multilateral levels, including at the United Nations, conducting their own advocacy with member states, and monitoring developments that are threatening their own agenda. So I think, given all of this, G7 leaders should really reaffirm their commitments to gender equality and human rights by protecting against these voices. If countries are committed to a feminist foreign policy, like a few G7 countries are, then this needs to be top priorities. And I think just a couple of steps to do this are, first, repeal discriminatory laws, including those that permit violence and harassment. Second, implement legislation protecting women human rights defenders. Third, ensure that all policies and programming are gender transformative. Fourth, invest in long-term and sustainable funding for feminist movements. Fifth, continue to conduct research on opposition groups so that we really understand where these movements are coming from, what's going on. And lastly, as my colleagues prioritized in their remarks, to really support feminist civil society and alliances. So given all of these developments, I hope that those are some tangible steps that G7 countries can make to really defend against anti-gender movements worldwide.
Thank you so much, Spagme, for laying out these points. I would like to, before coming to the round of final statements today, I would like to turn to you again and dig out one of the very concrete agendas that we actually have, the Istanbul Convention and its implementation in Europe. And we all know that it's at stake and that it's threatened. And I think it would be really important for the audience to hear from you how the German G7 presidency will assure to protect and strengthen the rights of LGBTIQ and BIPOC in foreign, but also, and I think this is a really important dimension of feminist foreign policy in a domestic context. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, thank you. Yeah, let me start maybe with the Istanbul Convention, because it's really horrific that now not only we see this global backlash against women's rights, but that even some countries have resigned from the Istanbul Convention, particularly Turkey. So we really made the promotion of this convention and the signing of this convention a top priority. Annalena Baerbock has just mentioned it again in her speech at the Council of Europe ministerial meeting last week, and really asked for everyone who hasn't signed it yet to sign it. We do so as well in diplomatic communication, but also in bilateral meetings with the non-signatories, like the Armenia, like the Czech Republic, because it's really the Istanbul Convention is really the most far-reaching legal instrument we have. So we really need to strengthen it, build on it, and use it to actually help to prevent and also combat gender-based violence. When it comes to LGBTIQ, here also, the most important sort of results always of this G7 process is first, that things are being brought on the agenda, right? So we've definitely done that, and also included the issue in the development ministers' communique that was just published. We are striving to include it in the leaders' declaration. So just also to really send this clear signal that yes, the G7 highlight this point, and we're pushing back against this backlash. And I think also it's in general it's a really good sign that by now we have 10 countries that have committed to a feminist foreign policy. We're very grateful to the front runners like Sweden, and we're actually now ourselves a bit in the process of learning from them. So we're basically, and also I heard very carefully the suggestions that you made now. So we're basically in listening mode to develop our own strategy of a feminist foreign policy, and to make sure that in the end it brings really tangible results.
Thank you very much. And I think it's pivotal to emphasize again that this is a room full of experts of civil society and feminist experts who have done a lot of work. You have all the knowledge here, and they're all happy to contribute and be part of the conversation. So what I would like to do now is give everyone on the panel the opportunity to have a final statement. And Sanam, I would like to start with you. Please remember to stick to your time limit a little bit. That would be great, like all of you, because I know there's so much to say, but we have so little time, and I hope that we can carry on this conversation at some other point. So Sanam, the floor is yours. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. I'll keep it very simple. 77 years ago, after World War II, world leaders at the time got together and they came up, the Charter of the UN was formed. It took us 500 years to finally create the institution. I've done the research into the history of what the ideas were. Finally, we get the UN after 2 world wars. And the essence of it is that future generations should never experience the scourge of war. 77 years later, we have over 80 million people internally displaced. We're spending over $2 trillion on weaponry. We are heading back into a place which is incredibly dangerous. And it really is up to our generation to change that it's like a big tanker. It's heading into a gigantic iceberg. We have to shift it. We have to turn it. And again, the good news is that we have so many of the structures in place. It's really about drawing on them, fostering the ecosystem for peace and the prevention of violence. It's about co-creation, because me sitting at an INGO, governments, local organizations, all of us are needed. And honestly, the cost of doing what I'm saying is minuscule compared to the cost of a missile or a nuclear warhead. I'm coming from England right now. we're putting 10 billion pounds into 14 new warheads, nuclear warheads. They're only useful if they're entirely useless. Just think about it. And why do we need 40? Again, I'm not naive. Let's have 35. Let's have 25. Put the money into human security, human rights, dignity. That's all most people want. We should not allow that 0.01% who benefit from war and violence to be dictating our futures forever. And that's really what's happening right now. So it's really a challenge to our generation and to our leaders right now. And I think we can do it. Thank you.
Thank you. Spagme, over to you.
Thanks. I'll just reiterate a point that Sana made earlier. But when we're looking at conflicts in Afghanistan, in Ukraine, all these protracted conflicts around the world, I think it's important to really use the feminist foreign policy framework to understand why it is that we got here in the first place. What are the systems of colonialism, capitalism, extractivism that continue to fuel these conflicts, and how do we avoid them? So I'll just reiterate that point once more and point to feminist foreign policy as a mechanism to humble ourselves, to imagine a new world order, and to chart a pathway forward that is more productive, that questions our positionality in traditional geopolitics and looks at a more peaceful world order. And of course, the point about funding, I'm glad that it was raised in the summit yesterday, and I'm glad that it's a priority today. But really, we're looking to G7 countries this year and in subsequent G7 summits, G20 summits, to commit more funds to gender equality globally, not just in their domestic budgets, but also as part of their official development assistance. And really to invest directly into feminist movements and to civil society globally, so that we know where the money is going, and we know that it's going to a more productive and transformative place.
Great. Thank you so much. Nahid.
Thank you. I'll take your 40 seconds. Before I say, I will stay with my time. Oxfam, thank you so much for being here. The Oxfam report just came out about 24 hours ago, if I'm not mistaken. I just want to give you some numbers that are going to be in your mind before I tell you why you'll connect the dots. 263 million and 573 million. 263 million is the number of people pushed into extreme poverty since the start of the pandemic. And 573 million, almost double, is the number of the new billionaires created since the start of the pandemic. The top 10 richest billionaires in the world, all men, by the way, are worth more than the bottom 40% of the entire human race. Billionaires' wealth went up more during the first 24 months of the pandemic than in the last 23 years combined. So for those who are trying to say that we have been together in this pandemic, please save it. We haven't been in solidarity in this pandemic. And at the same time, for these kind of billionaires, we call them super rich, the normal people. And for those who are really thinking about not taxing, we should be thinking about taxing these super rich billionaires. It is not okay for 10 men to be having more than 40% of the human race. That is not okay. There's something wrong there. And having said that, I would like, and this is a recommendation or a demand from a lot of the Afghan women experts and defenders, like Mariam Safi, and reinvest your money in WPS, please, because if you don't, what is happening in Afghanistan will be the case in many different countries. And it is the women's movement that upholds the values of the G7, that the G7 countries, so I always say this, they hold these values in word with such pride, but it is those women on the ground that do the work. So don't make that mistake to say that is the reason why we do things, but please walk the talk.
Thank you so much, Nahid. State Minister Luhrmann, the floor is yours before I hand over to Fumi to wrap up this really incredible panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, a foreign policy that's not feminist risks overlooking the interests and the rights of half of the population. So for me, it's a no-brainer that any foreign policy actually needs to be feminist. And I think all of us here agree on this observation. But and overall in the world, I think we've made progress towards this goal of a feminist foreign policy in some ways, and we have had setbacks in many other important ways. And the progress is that actually these kind of issues are now at the center of G7 meetings, that we have so many countries that commit to a feminist foreign policies, that we have a all too slow increase of women in the field of foreign policy, of representation, in the UN and security and all that. But we have horrific setbacks. I mean, just talking about Afghanistan, of course, where we had decades of at least hope, education, progress, and now really a lot of darkness. And we have setbacks when it comes also when we look around in Europe to far-right populist movements, to far-right extremist movements that are really challenging. I mean, I sit always right next to the German radical right party, AfD, in the parliament. What they say when women speak in parliament is not to be repeated here. So we have a lot of setbacks, and that's why I think we not only need to walk the talk, as you said, but we also, those of us that believe in this agenda, really need to combine forces and really need to work together in order to achieve our goals, because the opposition is really very fierce. And as I said, we are in the process of formulating this feminist foreign policy, so we're really open for suggestions, for your feedback, for your ideas, to include them now in our strategy. And I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation on that.
Thank you very much. And I would now like to ask Fumi Saito to come on stage and wrap up this panel for us and give your thoughts on what you've heard and what we're looking forward to maybe as well. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me to wrap up the last panel discussion, which is really intriguing and exciting to hear. In this session, actually, the panel is talking about gender-based violence and the implementation of feminist foreign policy. And I tried to be a little bit short. And then Spogme introduced the core principles of feminist foreign policy. And she also calling for accountability and a time-bound and measurable commitment. And also, Professor Sanam, she studied with historical background of women, peace and security from her experience for 22 years and focusing on people on the ground and gender responsiveness. And she also questioned all of us about our responsibility for the future generations and as opposed to the current trend of militarization. And Nahid talked about the diversion of the money from women, peace and security and UN women, and pointed out the situation of Afghan and Afghanistan women and girls, which is left behind from the current discussion. She also called on G7 leaders to create a space for Afghan women to lead the peace processes and intervention of Afghan. The minister emphasized to commit assistance to Ukraine to be gender responsive and gender justice and survivor centers. And she also promised to follow up to respond to Nahid. And also minister explained German commitment to Istanbul Convention. So I have to mention about the Istanbul Convention. Istanbul Convention, as the minister said, sets a holistic approach of the gender-based violence. And but so the Istanbul Convention is a convention of the Council of the Europe, but actually it doesn't prohibit other countries outside of Europe to join the convention. In fact, all countries in the G7 countries outside of the Europe, and which is United States and Canada and Japan, all have an observer status to the Council of Europe, which means, so the observer status countries have obligation to follow the principle of the Council of Europe, which means the G7 actually leader summit is the ideal platform to promote Istanbul Convention. So we, W7 advisors call on the G7 country or G7 leaders to follow the Istanbul Convention and then to promote the implementation of gender-based violence-related laws and policies, normative framework, and plans. And the last, actually, responding to Dr. Sanam's question and to all of us, and we have to do things differently. And how do we do it? One of the responses from W7 advisors is to implement feminist foreign policy. So that's all.
Thank you very much, Fumi. G7 leaders, there's a lot of work to do to translate everything that we just heard into tangible outcome. Feminist and women-led civil society organizations are here. They will challenge you and hold you accountable because it's time to deliver now. And this is where I hand over to Juliane again. Thank you all very much for being here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this very intense but very engaging panel. So we have a short break now to prepare ourselves for the presence of the G7 President and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Please be back at 1:30 sharp. See you then. Bye.